What made the Middle Ages so deadly? It wasn't just bad luck, it was baked into everyday life. No warning, no escape, and no second chances. People weren't just living through hard times. They were surrounded by things that made death feel like a normal part of the week. One of the biggest killers was disease. The Black Death swept through Europe between 1347 and 1351, like an uninvited guest who never left. This plague killed somewhere between 30 and 60% of the entire population. Walking into a crowded marketplace meant only 3 or 4 out of every 10 people would still be alive by the end of the outbreak. Bubonic plague spread through fleas that lived on rats, and medieval towns were basically rat paradise. Garbage piled up in streets, human waste flowed wherever gravity took it, and rodents had free run of every building. Even kings couldn't buy immunity from microscopic killers that didn't respect royal bloodlines. Medieval doctors believed diseases came from bad air called miasma. Their solution involved avoiding smelly places and hoping for the best. Medieval medicine was like trying to fix a broken car by sniffing the engine and declaring it cursed. Others thought illnesses were divine punishment for sin, which meant the cure required more prayer than actual treatment. Smallpox left survivors permanently scarred if they lived through the fever. Tuberculosis slowly destroyed lungs while victims continued their daily routines. Leprosy caused fingers and toes to rot away, leading to complete social rejection. Dysentery turned digestive systems inside out, causing death within days. Towns made everything worse by cramming people together like grain in a storage sack. Families shared single rooms with their animals. Pigs, chickens, and goats weren't just livestock, but roommates. Medieval housing was like camping permanently in a barn that someone forgot to clean. Water sources became contaminated quickly under these conditions. Wells were dug too close to waste pits, and rivers served as both drinking supply and sewer system. Many people switched to weak beer and wine because fermented drinks were safer than local water. Medical treatments often made patients worse rather than better. Doctors drained blood from people who were already weak, believing this restored bodily balance. Medieval pharmacies were like witch kitchens run by people who failed cooking class. Surgeons used the same unwashed tools on multiple patients, spreading infections faster than they could treat them. Quarantine rules existed, but rarely worked properly. Officials nailed boards over doors when plague struck, trapping healthy family members inside with sick ones. Wealthy families could bribe their way out while poor people had no choice but to follow the deadly rules. Children faced the greatest danger from these diseases. Most families expected several children to die before reaching adulthood. Parents often waited years before naming babies, hoping they would survive long enough to deserve names. But deadly diseases weren't the only threat medieval people faced on a daily basis. Medieval combat was essentially extreme sports without safety equipment or medical insurance. Knights in shining armor looked impressive, but underneath all that metal were regular people who bled just as easily as anyone else. Armor was like wearing an expensive suit to a knife fight. It helped, but not as much as you'd hope. Fighting happened face to face with swords, axes, maces, and other creative tools for ending lives. Most battles involved getting close enough to see your opponent's expressions change from confident to terrified. Medieval warfare made modern contact sports look like gentle dance lessons. The real killer wasn't usually the original wound, but what happened afterward. A sword cut might not kill immediately, but infection would finish the job within days. Gangrene turned minor injuries into death sentences as flesh rotted around damaged areas. Battle wounds had about a 50% survival rate, which were terrible odds for something that was supposed to be heroic. Weapons were designed to cause maximum damage through armor and flesh. Warhammers could crush bones through metal plates, while crossbow bolts punched through armor like it was made of paper. Medieval weapons designers clearly weren't concerned with user-friendly features or safety warnings. Full suits of armor could weigh 60 pounds or more. Try jogging in that for several hours while people swing sharp objects at your head. Knights sometimes died from overheating inside their own protective gear during summer campaigns, or drowned when they fell into water because the armor was too heavy for swimming. Battles often lasted hours or stretched across multiple days. Soldiers got exhausted, hungry, and thirsty while still needing to stay alive and fight effectively. Rain turned battlefields into muddy disasters where men slipped under the weight of their equipment. Medieval battles were like deadly wrestling matches held in pig pens during thunderstorms. Army camps were perfect breeding grounds for illness. Thousands of men living together with poor sanitation created ideal conditions for disease to spread rapidly. Food poisoning from spoiled supplies was common enough that soldiers got used to feeling sick before battles even began. Medical care on battlefields consisted mainly of sawing off damaged limbs with tools that got used on multiple patients without cleaning. Pain relief involved alcohol and leather straps to bite down on. Many soldiers died from shock during operations rather than from their original wounds. Wounded soldiers who couldn't keep up with their units were often abandoned to die or be captured. Battle aftermath brought scavengers who picked through dead and dying bodies, taking anything valuable while finishing off survivors. The violence of warfare extended beyond battlefields, affecting how people lived and where they could find food to survive. Food security in medieval Europe was about as reliable as predicting tomorrow's weather by looking at clouds. The Great Famine of 1315 to 1317 showed that nature could be more destructive than any human army. Heavy rains and cold temperatures turned growing seasons into agricultural disasters, while farmers watched their year's work dissolve into muddy soup. Endless rainfall prevented harvesting and rotted plants in the fields. Wheat, barley, and oats simply wouldn't grow in waterlogged soil. The few crops that survived were often moldy and dangerous to eat, but people consumed them anyway because the alternative was dying of hunger. Medieval grocery shopping was like playing Russian roulette with your digestive system. Food prices exploded during shortages. A loaf of bread that normally cost a few coins suddenly required a week's wages. Families sold everything they owned just to afford enough food to survive another day. Medieval shopping during famines made modern Black Friday look like a peaceful library visit. Rich families had some protection through stored grain, but even wealth couldn't buy what didn't exist. When crops failed across entire regions, money became worthless. Some nobles ended up eating their seed grain, which guaranteed worse harvests the following year. Poor families made impossible choices during food shortages. Parents gave their portions to children, slowly starving themselves to keep their families alive longer. Medieval parenting meant literally taking food from your own mouth to feed your kids. Desperate families sometimes abandoned children at monastery doors, hoping religious communities might have enough resources. Hunger weakened immune systems and made people vulnerable to diseases that healthy bodies might fight off successfully. Malnourished populations became like wounded animals surrounded by predators. The Little Ice Age created additional farming challenges by shortening growing seasons and increasing crop failure risks. Desperate situations led to desperate solutions. People ate tree bark, grass, and dirt mixed with flour to fill empty stomachs. Animals that were normally protected, horses, dogs, cats, and rats, ended up in cooking pots. Some communities resorted to eating leather goods, boiled into soups that provided minimal nutrition. Hunger drove normally honest people to theft and robbery. Bandit groups formed in rural areas, raiding villages for whatever food they could find. Food riots erupted when grain stores ran empty, with angry crowds attacking bakeries and anyone suspected of hoarding supplies. Recovery from famine could take years or decades. Even when crops started growing again, rebuilding livestock herds, replacing farming tools, and restoring normal production took time that many people didn't have. The struggle for food was made even more difficult by the terrible conditions in which people had to live every day. Medieval homes would make modern college dormitories look like luxury palaces. Most people lived in 1 or 2 rooms made from whatever materials they could find or afford. Wealthy peasants might have wooden frames with walls made from wattle and daub, basically sticks woven together and covered with mud, animal droppings, and straw. Entire families shared single rooms with their livestock. Pigs, chickens, goats, and sometimes cows lived alongside humans year-round. Medieval homes were like permanent petting zoos where all the animals were roommates and nobody cleaned up after them. Animals provided warmth during winter, but also brought fleas, lice, and smells that would empty modern buildings in minutes. Floors were packed earth covered with rushes or straw that got changed when the odor became unbearable. These coverings collected food scraps, animal waste, and debris that created perfect breeding grounds for insects and rodents. Medieval flooring was basically compost piles that people walked on every day. Bathing was rare and often considered dangerous. Many believed frequent washing opened pores and made bodies vulnerable to illness. Medieval hygiene advice was like getting health tips from people who thought soap was poisonous. Most people might bathe a few times yearly, if at all. Teeth were disasters waiting to happen. People lost teeth to injury, infection, and wear from eating coarse bread filled with grit from grinding stones. Medieval dental care was like trying to fix broken equipment without tools, knowledge, or pain relief. Toilets meant trips to outdoor holes dug in the ground, regardless of weather, time of day, or urgency. Waste disposal involved throwing everything into streets, rivers, or cesspits. Medieval garbage collection was basically throwing everything elsewhere and hoping it would disappear. Household pests were constant companions. Fleas and lice lived in hair, clothing, and bedding, while rats and mice helped themselves to any available food. Medieval pest control consisted of cats, prayers, and resignation to sharing homes with unwanted creatures. These terrible living conditions were made even worse when people had to leave their homes and venture into the dangerous world beyond their villages. Medieval travel was like extreme adventure sports with real consequences and no safety net. Going anywhere beyond your village meant risking your life on roads that were barely more than dirt paths. These routes turned into muddy rivers during rain and dusty nightmares during dry weather. Bridges were rare and often in poor repair, forcing travelers to ford dangerous rivers or pay expensive tolls. Merchants unknowingly served as disease delivery services, carrying invisible passengers along with their trade goods. Bacteria, viruses, and parasites hitched rides on cargo ships and wagon trains, exploring new territories where local populations had no immunity. Medieval trade routes were like express highways for microscopic tourists looking for fresh victims. Ships were floating laboratories for growing and spreading diseases. Rats lived in cargo holds, eating grain shipments and reproducing faster than ship cats could control them. Medieval vessels were basically rat apartment buildings with sails attached. When these disease-carrying ships docked at ports, they unloaded more than trade goods. They delivered death to unsuspecting coastal communities. Port cities became international meeting places for illnesses from around the world. Medieval harbors were like airports for germs, except nobody checked health certificates and everyone was welcome to spread whatever they carried. Venice, Genoa, and other wealthy ports saw constant cycles of disease outbreaks as ships arrived from distant lands. Religious pilgrimages brought together thousands of people from across Europe who then returned home carrying new diseases to their isolated villages. Medieval spiritual journeys were massive gatherings where everyone prayed for salvation while accidentally sharing their microscopic companions. Military campaigns transported armies across vast distances, spreading regional diseases wherever they marched. Soldiers collected new illnesses along the way, creating mobile disease laboratories that infected every community they passed through. Inns and taverns were necessary stops for travelers, but perfect places for diseases to jump between people. Multiple strangers sharing beds and using common facilities created ideal transmission conditions. Medieval hotels were like disease exchange programs with uncomfortable beds and questionable food. Weather made traveling more dangerous and disease-prone. Rain turned roads into impassable mud that trapped travelers for days in unsanitary conditions, while summer heat caused dehydration that could be fatal for travelers caught on open roads. Communication traveled slowly and unreliably, so disease outbreaks could spread for weeks before distant communities received warnings. Medieval news moved at horse speed, which was usually slower than the plagues it was reporting. All this movement of people, goods, and diseases was made even more dangerous by the constant chaos and violence that plagued medieval society. Medieval government made modern political dysfunction look like a perfectly organized system. Kings, nobles, bishops, and local lords constantly fought over power, territory, and resources, while ordinary people got caught in the middle. Medieval political campaigns were settled with actual swords instead of attack advertisements. Feudalism was supposed to provide order and protection, but often created more chaos than it prevented. Local lords maintained private armies and made their own rules, leading to conflicts that could explode over the smallest disputes. Medieval politics was like having hundreds of different bosses who all hated each other and expected contradictory loyalty. Justice systems were harsh, inconsistent, and frequently corrupt. Punishments might depend more on social status and bribery ability than actual crimes committed. Medieval courts were like rigged carnival games where the house always won and players without money never got fair chances. Trials by combat meant legal disputes were literally fought to the death. Private armies supposedly maintained order, but often acted like organized bandits when wages ran late. These groups served nobles in theory, but frequently terrorized communities when their employers couldn't pay them. Medieval law enforcement was like hiring pirates to run neighborhood security patrols. Witch hunts and religious persecutions created climates of fear that destroyed communities from within. False accusations could ruin lives even when completely baseless. Medieval social media was basically pointing at someone and shouting witch until everyone believed it. Political turmoil disrupted agriculture and trade, making food shortages worse. When nobles spent their time fighting each other, nobody maintained roads, protected merchants, or ensured fair markets. Succession disputes turned entire kingdoms into battlegrounds whenever rulers died without clear heirs. Corruption was built into the system from top to bottom. Officials expected bribes as regular income, judges sold verdicts to highest bidders, and tax collectors kept most of what they gathered for themselves. Border regions suffered constant raids as neighboring powers tested each other's strength. All these political problems combined with diseases, warfare, famines, and poor living conditions to create perfect storms of deadly circumstances that defined medieval existence. The Middle Ages weren't just one dangerous problem, they were multiple deadly challenges happening all at once. Medieval Europe was essentially a survival challenge where death lurked around every corner. Disease, violence, hunger, terrible living conditions, and political chaos all worked together to make daily life incredibly dangerous. Yet somehow people persevered through these difficult times and built the foundation for our modern world.